Okay, folks, this particular PowerPoint is on descriptive ethics. And so it's kind of like a little interlude addressing the issue that science seems to always be encroaching upon all the other disciplines these days, the hard sciences, on the social sciences and on other disciplines as well, sort of saying that we don't need them anymore, and that science can do it all for us. And it is amazing what science and technology have given us. I mean, you're seeing something that's a product of that by watching this video. Anyway, as always, we have our motif of aiming and shooting at the good of archery, and archery being our motif by which we communicate the idea that we're trying to find out how to make the best ethical, moral decisions, and we're doing so by different methodologies, some of which focus on the good, some on the right, and some on the ought, or the idea of moral duty. To begin, Lewis Vaughan, well-known philosopher and writer of philosophy textbooks, says of ethics, ethics does not give us a royal road to moral truth. Instead, it shows us how to ask critical questions about morality and systematically seeks answers supported by good reasons. A very rough characterization of philosophy is the systematic use of critical reasoning to answer the most fundamental questions in life. I like that definition. I think that's a pretty good characterization of philosophy. So this is Albert Einstein writing in 1954, and he says something interesting. He says, science can only ascertain what is, ontology, isness, but not what should be, prescriptivity, which is what ethics deals with. Science can only ascertain what is. It can tell us about what actually is the current state of affairs, or what actually exists, but it cannot tell us what should be. So, a word of caution regarding so-called scientific or descriptive ethics. Science can only take us just so far in our search for good and right and ought. But we have a lot of people in the field of science who make pretensions to it being able to do more. Why do I say it can only take us just so far? I'm going to share with you what I call a tale of two textbooks. When I was doing my master's work in family life education, which I've said to you is basically human development, in the intro to the course I said that, I had to do a particular course where we were involved in what was called Zeta methodology. In Zeta methodology, you had to take a science textbook and a textbook from one of the social sciences addressing the same topic and compare them. So you can see that this is a kind of a pretty book. It's in really nice shape, and it had the the newest cutting edge stuff back in the day. This is a DVD. This is when DVDs first came out. And you can see the book looks almost completely new. It's a scientific textbook on human sexuality. And then you can see this book that came out at about the same time. It was the second edition of it, Fundamentals of Human Sexuality, but this is a psych book. So if I hold the two books up to you, which one of them is the more loved, more well-used book? Obviously, this one has spent a lot of time on the shelf, and this one has had a lot of usage. Why is that? Well, because this book can really only tell us about the plumbing, about the mechanics and the biology, the chemistry of sexuality, and about different sexual practices. But it really can't tell us much with regard to what we ought to do sexually. It hasn't got the ability, I was dumbfounded to discover, that when it addressed things like paraphilia is a general categorization for strange sexual practices, and I'm not trying to be gross or disgusting, but things like necrophilia, people having sex with dead bodies, or like bestiality, people having relations with animals, or pedophilia, people having relations with children, it could not tell you that those things were wrong. All it could do was statistically tell you that those things happened. A certain percentage of human beings, thank God, minuscule percentage of human beings, would practice these things. Whereas in the psych sexuality book, it could tell you that those things were not good for you, that they were bad, that they were associated with psychoses, that they would have a negative effect upon human beings. Stay away. Now, I want to say psychology is not morality. It's not synonymous with morality, but it had much more ability to speak to the issue of whether or not these things were good for you. And so I discovered how, in a sense, how inert or how impotent my science textbook was for addressing oughtness, or what ought to be sexually. So these are 3 books that are scientific approaches to ethics. 2 of them are pretty well known: Mark Hauser's Moral Minds, The Nature of Right and Wrong, and Michael Shermer's The Science of Good and Evil. And basically what they're setting forth is a thought process that says that ethics are a side effect, or they're a product of the evolutionary process of the human species. Interestingly, both men who are very focused on science have to use an awful lot of philosophy to write those books. And then Sam Harris, who's one of the well-known 4 horsemen of the New Atheism, the late Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and, of course, Richard Dawkins. So Sam Harris has written a book, How Science Can Determine Human Values. Interestingly, he had to go outside the field of science in order to write this book. Basically what he uses is a secular natural law form of reasoning. Let me read you what it says here. Lively, provocative, and timely, Harris makes a powerful case for a morality that is based on human flourishing. Well, that's an idea that comes from Aristotle. Eudaimonia is what means human flourishing, and thoroughly enmeshed with science and rationality. It is a tremendously appealing vision, one that no thinking person can afford to ignore, and that's Steven Pinker, who I've made mention of in this course. But the interesting thing is, Harris can't get this done just using science. He has to use philosophy in order to teach what he tries to teach there, or to put forward his thesis. So this is Erwin Schrödinger. Many of you are familiar with from physics, the thought experiment called Schrödinger's cat, with which Schrödinger is illustrating the idea of quantum uncertainty. And he's writing in the 1950s, and he says, I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, puts all of our experiences in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that's really near to our hearts and that really matters to us. It knows nothing of the beautiful and the ugly, good or bad, or God and eternity. Now, he's not an ostensibly or outwardly religious man. He's a Jewish man. But Schrödinger is not known for his religion, but he's saying it can't speak to those other things. He's not being religious here. Don't misunderstand. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, he says, but the answers are very often so silly that we're not inclined to take them seriously. So the next one is the phenomenologist, and I'm going to forget his, Edmund Husserl. So Husserl says this. He says a change has set in the turn of the last century about what science means for human existence. Science excludes, in principle, precisely the questions which human beings, given over to it in our unhappy times, find the most burning questions about the meaning and meaninglessness of this whole human existence. He's writing this in the wake of the Second World War and at the discovery of the awful things done by the Nazi scientists in the final solution. He says science is incapable of even asking, let alone answering, the questions that are most important in life. There's not a single question that is important to human existence that science can answer. Now, what's the point? I got a few more quotes like this. So what's the point? Am I here to diss science? Is that the idea? No. In fact, I love science, and the field that I thought I would be in originally in my life was that of marine biology, and my life took a turn away from there, and I've stayed always a student of the sciences. I love the sciences. I'm not trying to put down the sciences. Don't misunderstand. But the point is that science in itself, the process by which we do scientific research, is limited, and it's really impotent in the field of ethics, as these individuals have both touched upon. So this is Jerry Fodor, and Jerry Fodor, excuse me, this is not Jerry Fodor, this is Peter Medawar. This is Peter Medawar, and he's the Nobel Prize winner for his work in the field of organ transplantation. If you know anybody that's had a transplanted organ, they benefited from the research of Nobel Prize winner Sir Peter Medawar. In his book, The Ultimate Question, so this is a top, medical scientist. In his book, The Ultimate Questions, he says that there is indeed a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. Questions like, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It would be universally agreed that it is not to science that we should look for answers to these questions. So That's a man of science saying science is limited. It really can't offer us answers in these fields. This is J.C. Polkinghorne. You see the alphabet soup behind his name? That's Knight of the British Empire, Fellow of the Royal Society, Doctor of Science, Ph.D. He's got a whole nother set of education now in the field of theology. And he was the man who was next door to and good friends with Stephen Hawking at Cambridge University for many, many years. He's a mathematician. He says beauty slips through the scientist's net. You could take a performance of Bach's Mass in B minor and Fourier analyze the pattern of sound until you were blue in the face, but by those means you would never come to appreciate what it is all about. An exhaustive chemical analysis of the pigments of a Rembrandt self-portrait would miss the point of the picture. And then Jerry Fodor, who I mentioned earlier mistakenly. Jerry Fodor is a cognitive scientist from Rutgers University. He says science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it can't tell us what is wrong with how we are, which is basically Einstein's point at the beginning of all this. In an interview with the Irish writer James Murphy, Einstein said this. He said, "Our moral judgments, our sense of beauty and religious instincts are tributary forms in helping the reasoning faculty towards its highest achievements. You are right in speaking of the moral foundations of science, but you cannot turn it around and speak of the scientific foundations of morality. For science cannot teach men to be moral, and every attempt to reduce ethics to scientific formulae must fail." What's the point? The point is this. We need to understand the limitations of any so-called scientific approach to ethics. Secular ethics is without recourse to religion, but it's not the same thing as scientific ethics. So what you're studying in this course is you're studying secular ethics. This is not a religious ethics course. But secular ethics nonetheless is not as limited as scientific ethics is. Scientific ethics, by its very nature, can only be descriptive. And if secular ethics were that limited, it would really have no content as far as being able to tell you what you ought to do. And that's basically what I've got to say here, so that you would understand the limitations of science when we come to this field and realize we need this field. We need ethics.